In this third lecture on eyewitnesses, we're going to finish up our discussion of system variables, and then in the final lecture talk about some of the witness or estimator variables that are relevant in eyewitness testimony. So we've talked about lots of different system variables, but we haven't talked about this one, and this one's a very important one, the lineup presentation mode. The way that we typically do lineups is what we call a conventional simultaneous parade. So what you do is you present faces to the witness at the same time, and the witness then looks at all the faces and picks out the person that they think is the perpetrator. The problem with this is that it fosters what we call a relative judgment strategy. Now, we're going to see a short video here in a few minutes, and it'll explain it a little bit better. But what you're basically doing is comparing the faces to one another and trying to pick out the best one, which is not really the best strategy, and in fact can lead to more mistakes. A better lineup strategy, and one that's been proven over and over to be more superior, is what we call a sequential lineup. What you do here is you present the members one at a time, okay? And at each time a face is presented, the person is required to say yes or no, that is or is not the perpetrator. So what you're doing is you're asking for an absolute judgment rather than a relative judgment. And in this little short film that I'm going to show right now, it'll give you a better idea of why and how this one type of lineup is superior to the other. So let's take a look at that.
So, how should the photographs used in the lineup be presented to the eyewitness? One choice is whether we present the photographs simultaneously, that is, they are laid out side by side in front of the eyewitness so that they could all be viewed at once. However, one problem with this approach is that it may encourage relative rather than absolute judgments. That is, eyewitnesses approach the task as being to determine who in the lineup looks relatively most like the criminal, rather than an absolute decision as to whether the criminal is actually present or not. That is, the structure of simultaneous lineups may foster the same sort of bias to pick someone as biased instructions do. What can we do about this? Well, one alternative is to use a strategy suggested by Roderick Lindsay of Queen's University and Gary Wells of the University of Alberta, known as the sequential lineup. This is where each member of a lineup is viewed in turn. The eyewitness is asked, "Is this the person you saw?" and they have to answer yes or no. In the ideal version of this, eyewitnesses wouldn't know in advance how many photos will be in the lineup, and the procedure will stop on the first positive ID. The idea is that with a sequential approach, we minimize that implicit imperative for eyewitnesses to compare the lineup members with one another, that problematic relative judgment. Instead, they are effectively being told to compare each individual against their memory of the real criminal. That is, they're making an absolute judgment, and it's the absolute judgment that we want. That's the principle, but is there any evidence to suggest that using the sequential rather than the simultaneous presentation helps witnesses correctly identify the suspect more often? Nancy Steble of Augsburg College and her colleagues did a meta-analysis of 30 research studies looking at this very question, and concluded that using the sequential lineup procedure did indeed result in fewer false identifications than simultaneous presentations. There was some evidence that sequential lineups resulted in fewer correct hits, as well as fewer false positives, following the same reasoning with biased instructions. However, in this case, Nancy Steble reported that when she took more realistic conditions into account, this effect largely disappeared. That is, sequential lineups didn't result in fewer correct hits when real-world factors were considered. So the current consensus appears to be that sequential lineups are better practice than simultaneous lineups. One other technique that's been investigated by psychologists to address the issue of response bias in eyewitnesses is to first deliberately show them a blank lineup where none of the members of the lineup are the suspect. The idea is that if your eyewitness does pick someone from the lineup that you know for sure has no criminals in, then this may indicate that their judgment on the real lineup should be called into question. You've essentially screened them for an inappropriate response bias. Gary Wells investigated whether this strategy worked or not, and he found that whether or not eyewitnesses made a false ID on the blank lineup predicted whether they would make a false ID on the real lineup. That is, we have evidence that this technique works. In the next presentation, we'll turn our attention to the members of the lineup who aren't the suspect, the people we know are innocent, and how we ought to go about choosing them.
Of course, that next video is going to be about lineup fairness, and that's something that we've already talked about. So in terms of sequential versus simultaneous lineups, the data and the research is pretty, resolute that sequential is better. And you see that many police stations, many police jurisdictions across the country have started switching from simultaneous to sequential lineups. Of course, when you watch CSI or any of your cop shows, they're still using simultaneous lineups. They haven't quite, Hollywood hasn't quite caught up with the psych and law research. Okay, let's take a look at another system variable. And this is post-identification feedback. So this is information that's given to a witness after they've made an identification from a lineup. So remember in picking cotton, Jennifer got some post-identification feedback. And so this is any kind of information that's conveyed to the witness after they make the choice. Now, to give you an example, here's a transcript from an actual case that was published in one of the Psych and Law papers. So here you've got an eyewitness to a crime on viewing the lineup. And she says, "Oh my God, I don't know. It's one of those two, but I don't know. Oh man, the guy a little taller than number two, it's one of those two, but I don't know." Eyewitness, 30 minutes later, still viewing the lineup and having difficulty making a decision. She says, "I don't know, number two." And the officer administering the lineup says, "Okay." Months later at trial, she was asked on the stand, "You were positive it was number two? It wasn't a maybe?" And the answer from the witness was, "There was no maybe about it. I was absolutely positive." Now the question is, was she lying? Was she absolutely just lying through her teeth and perjuring herself? I don't think so. I think she came to believe that what happened at the time of the lineup wasn't exactly what happened. So in this particular case, the officer didn't really give too much info post-identification, but I just wanted to show you this case because it's an extreme example of what can happen to a witness in terms of how they reacted at the time of the lineup and then months later when they're testifying. Just think about how confident she might have been if the officer didn't just say, "Okay," but said, "You got it right," or "Great job," or something like that. So post-identification feedback is when the witness gets some kind of information suggesting that they did it correctly. Now, what does post-identification feedback do? Well, basically, it has a huge effect on the confidence of the witness, okay? So I'm going to share with you in this particular study, this was a study done in 2004. What happened was the participants viewed a crime video, okay, and they were given a target absent lineup. After choosing someone or not choosing someone, they either said, "No, they're not in the lineup," or they mistakenly identified somebody. One group was given feedback. So in the feedback condition, they were told that 84% of the other people in the study also gave that response. So for example, if you pick someone, we'd say, "Oh, great, 84% of the people that we've studied pick that same person. Or if you said, no, the target's not in the lineup, you're told, oh, 84% of the people have said the same thing. So what they're basically doing is giving you some post-identification feedback. Then what they did was they looked, a couple of weeks later, they looked at their confidence. They went back and interviewed the participants and say, how confident are you that you were correct? And here are the results of the study. No surprise here that given the feedback, people who are given the feedback became more confident after the feedback. And you see that this was especially true in the mistaken identification condition. So what you have here is that any kind of feedback makes the witness seem more confident. Now, why is confidence a big deal? It turns out that confidence, how confident a witness is, affects the jury. So jurors are much more likely to believe a witness who confidently states on the stand, you know, I knew it all along, I never made any mistake, I'm absolutely correct. And jurors are particularly sensitive to confidence. And so if a witness is confident, they're likely to believe them. Strangely enough, it turns out there's absolutely no correlation between confidence and validity. In other words, confidence does not predict whether or not you're right. So the jurors are using cues to determine whether a witness got something right, and they're using a cue that absolutely has no relationship to validity. So that's why confidence is so important. Okay, so this is one way in which you can sort of change people's confidence, but there are other ways in which feedback can affect witnesses. So one example is memory contamination from co-witness discussion. Now here's a study. So this is a fairly clever method. You have two people come in and they're watching the same event. They're sitting right beside each other. And unbeknownst to them, because you put on a special pair of glasses, unbeknownst to them, you're not actually seeing the same film. So in one instance, the participant sees viewpoint 1, okay? And this is a viewpoint from the doorway. What they do during the clip, they see an actress come in, she's checking her watch, and then she looks around and she sees money on a desk and she steals the money. Viewpoint 2 is inside the room. And that person sees the title of the book that the actress is carrying, and they see her walk into the room and throw a note into the trash. So one person sees a theft, another person sees her just walking around. After the video was complete, they were asked to recall what they saw in the video. And here's where the experimental condition was. Half of the participants were separated from the other person and asked to recall what they saw in the video. The experimental group was asked to recall the information in pairs. So just think about what this means. I'm sitting next to somebody. We sat and watched the same video. And although there are lots of things that we have in common, we described the actress the same, she's wearing the same things, the person sitting next to me saw something slightly different than I did. And so I'm going to hear what they have to say. 1 hour later in this particular experience, they did a second recall test where they asked the witnesses to then report information from the videos. And so 1 hour later, they did a recall test. So tell me everything that happened in the video. And look at the results here. They're pretty stunning. If you look at this, and by the way, this particular study looked at young adults and older adults to see if there are any age differences, and there really wasn't. So let me just take you through this. Here you have an individual. So they were interviewed individually, so they didn't hear the co-witness. They weren't contaminated. And did they incorporate the misinformation an hour later? No, they did not. Okay. So all 30 of the people did not incorporate any kind of misinformation, which makes sense because they didn't hear any misinformation. But look at the co-witness condition. 21 of the 30 people incorporated some of the misinformation that they heard from the co-witness. And this is a great example of co-witness contamination. And then again, the same thing happened with the older adults. Now, importantly is not just that they incorporate the information, they also looked at attributions of guilt. By the way, this only includes the people who were in the condition that did not witness the crime. You know, the one viewpoint where she simply threw the note in a trash, because you want to know whether people who did not see a crime not only incorporate the information into their story, but start to think that the actress is guilty. And in fact, you do see this happening here. Look here in the condition with a co-witness, you've got an almost even split here, thinking that she's guilty of stealing, even though you never actually saw that actress do that. And again, the same thing happening with older adults. So this is an example of co-witness contamination. And you might ask yourself, does this really happen in real life? Well, actually, it has happened in real life. The conviction of Barry George in the murder of Jill Dando. This is a case in which Jill Dando was a news reporter in the UK, and as she was walking up to her apartment, somebody came up and shot her in the head and killed her. Barry George was the person who was nabbed as a suspect, and he was found guilty and sentenced to prison, and it was only after a number of years that he was exonerated. But this particular case demonstrated the influence of co-witness contamination in an actual case, and that this actually happens. So here are the specifics of the Dando case. So what happened was, after the person who shot Jill Dando was seen for only a brief moment. There were about 4 witnesses that saw some part of the crime, but when Barry George was picked up and witnesses were asked to identify the perpetrator in the lineup, only 1 witness identified Barry George. 3 of them made no identification, not whatsoever. 3 of the 4 witnesses claimed that they only had a fleeting glance at the time the crime occurred, which, by the way, is a witness factor. So what they're saying is they did not have enough time. When the 4 witnesses were brought to the police station, they did the lineups. And what the police did was they put these 4 witnesses into taxi cabs together to ride from the police station to go back home. And of course, what happened was, what do you think happened? While they were in the taxi, they talked to each other. And so they shared information. And what happened is that after that, then the other 3 witnesses then picked Barry George out of a lineup. And then they were more confident by the time the court trial came that George was the one, and that they were absolutely sure from the very beginning. So again, boosting witness confidence. And it was boosted to the point where the jury had no idea that 3 of the 4 witnesses didn't make an identification the first time around, so they weren't told. Okay, so we're done looking at the system variables, and like I said, next time we're going to look at some of the witness variables. But before we go, I just want to share with you, you've been hearing a lot about the Innocence Project, and you're certainly going to hear a lot more about the Innocence Project. And I want to share with you the website, the Innocence Project website, and just show you, if you're interested in looking at the Innocence Project and some of the things that they do, you can go to their website. This is their 25th anniversary, and you see it's www.innocenceproject.org. And what you have there's a lot of information of the cases that they have exonerated. So you can go up here and click on this, and you can, I think many of you may know Steve Avery, but there's lots of other cases as well. So here are all and if you wanted to see them all, there's quite a few. Okay, these are all exonerees. You can read their stories, you can learn about what was going on, and so forth and so on. You can also learn more about the Innocence Project, what they're doing. And I have some former students that actually work for the Rocky Mountain Innocence Project. So if it's something that you're interested in, check it out. Okay? So next time we're going to go back to eyewitness factors. And again, like I said, it's the final eyewitness lecture, and we'll talk about the estimator variables.